The music pulsed through the walls of the Brooklyn loft, a relentless throb that shook the floorboards and drowned out the chaos in Julian Carter's head. He was 25, drowning in glitter and sweat, his hazel eyes catching the strobe lights as he spun through the crowd, a red Solo cup in hand, laughter spilling from his lips like it could erase the past. To everyone at the party, he was the golden boy, charismatic, reckless, untouchable. But beneath the surface, his world was unraveling, thread by thread. Julian had been the life of every party since his freshman year at NYU, but the truth was a shadow he couldn't outrun. He'd burned through his entire college fund, $80,000, on nights like this, on drinks, drugs, and fleeting highs that made him feel alive for a moment. His parents, back in Ohio, thought he was a semester away from a finance degree. Instead, he was a dropout, faking his way through a life he couldn't afford, hiding not just his failures but the deeper secret he'd buried since high school. He was gay, and he was terrified of what that truth might cost him. Tonight, though, something was different. Amid the blur of bodies and bass lines, Julian's eyes locked onto a stranger across the room. The man was tall, with curly black hair and a quiet intensity that cut through the chaos. His name, Julian would later learn, was Ezra Martinez, a 26-year-old graphic designer who'd moved to New York from Miami to chase his art. Ezra stood by the bar, his dark eyes scanning the crowd until they met Julian's. It was a moment that felt like the world slowing down, a spark that made Julian's heart stutter, not from the substances coursing through him, but from something real, something dangerous. Julian pushed through the crowd, his usual confidence tinged with a nervous edge. "You look like you're judging this whole scene," he said, flashing a grin as he leaned against the bar beside Ezra. Ezra raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching into a half-smile. "Maybe I am. You look like you're running it." They talked for hours, the party fading into the background. Ezra's voice was low and warm, his words deliberate, like he weighed each one before letting it go. He spoke about his art, his Cuban heritage, the way New York's chaos inspired him. Julian, usually so guarded, found himself spilling truths he hadn't meant to share. About the pressure to be perfect, the lies he'd told his family, the way he felt like a fraud every day. He didn't mention being gay. Not yet. But the way Ezra looked at him, like he could see through the mask, made Julian want to confess everything. By 3 a.m., they were on the rooftop, the city sprawling below them like a glittering promise. The air was cool, and Julian's buzz was fading, leaving him raw and exposed. Ezra leaned against the railing, his silhouette sharp against the skyline. "You don't have to keep up the act, you know," he said softly. "Not with me." Julian's breath caught. He wanted to laugh it off, to deflect like he always did, but Ezra's gaze held him in place. "You don't know me," he said, his voice quieter than he meant. "I want to," Ezra replied, stepping closer. Their fingers brushed, and Julian didn't pull away. For the first time in years, he felt seen. Not the party king, not the liar, just Julian. The next morning, Julian woke up in his cramped Bushwick apartment, the memory of Ezra's touch lingering like a bruise. His phone buzzed with a text. "Coffee? It's on me. Ezra." Julian stared at the message, his heart racing. He'd spent years hiding, running, pretending. But Ezra was different, and that scared him more than anything. Because Julian wasn't just hiding his sexuality. He was hiding a debt that could destroy him. A secret deal he'd made to keep his life afloat, and a past that was catching up faster than he could run. Over the next few weeks, Julian and Ezra fell into a rhythm. Coffee dates turned into late-night walks through the village, then quiet evenings in Ezra's tiny studio, where Julian would watch him sketch, mesmerized by the way his hands moved. Ezra was patient, never pushing Julian to reveal more than he was ready to. But his presence was a mirror, reflecting back the parts of Julian he'd tried to bury. For the first time, Julian imagined a life where he could be honest. About his love, his failures, everything. But the lies were a house of cards, and they were starting to wobble. Julian's roommate, Lila, a sharp-witted 24-year-old barista with a knack for sniffing out bullshit, noticed the cracks first. "You're different lately," she said one night, eyeing him over a bowl of ramen. "Happier but scared." "What's going on, Jay?" "Nothing," Julian lied, but his voice betrayed him. Lila didn't push, but her look said she wasn't buying it. The truth was, Julian was drowning. He'd been borrowing money from a shady lender named Marco, a guy he'd met at a club 2 years ago. Marco didn't ask questions, but his loans came with strings, errands, deliveries, things Julian didn't want to think too hard about. At first, it was just a way to keep the parties going, to maintain the illusion of success. But now, Marco was calling in favors, and the jobs were getting riskier. Julian knew he was in too deep, but he couldn't see a way out. One night, Ezra invited Julian to an art gallery opening in Chelsea, a world away from the gritty clubs Julian usually haunted. Ezra's work was on display, a series of vibrant, emotional portraits that captured the raw humanity of their subjects. Julian stood in front of one, a painting of a young man with eyes that looked too much like his own, and felt his chest tighten. "This is incredible," he said, turning to Ezra. "You're incredible," Ezra replied, his voice low, and before Julian could think, Ezra kissed him. It was soft, tentative, but it set Julian's world on fire. For a moment he forgot the lies, the debt, the fear. But when they pulled apart, reality crashed back. Marco had texted him an hour ago, "Meet me at the warehouse. Midnight. Don't be late." Julian's hands shook as he excused himself to the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face. He couldn't drag Ezra into his mess. But as he looked in the mirror, he realized he was already falling for him, and that made everything more dangerous. The warehouse was a cavern of shadows, the kind of place where secrets went to die. Julian stood in the freezing cold, his breath visible in the dim light filtering through cracked windows. Marco, a wiry man in his 40s with a scar across his left cheek, leaned against a crate, his eyes glinting with something predatory. "You're late," he said, tossing Julian a burner phone. "Tomorrow night. Delivery. You know the drill." Julian nodded, his stomach twisting. He'd done these runs before, small packages, shady drop-offs, cash exchanges in dark alleys. He told himself it was just business, that he wasn't hurting anyone, but the weight of it was crushing him. "This is the last one," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Marco laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "You're in no position to make demands, kid. You owe me 20 grand. You think your pretty face is gonna pay that off?" Julian's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He pocketed the phone and left, the cold biting at his skin as he stepped into the night. His phone buzzed, Ezra checking in. "Miss you already. Come over?" Julian wanted nothing more than to lose himself in Ezra's warmth. But he couldn't. Not tonight. Not with Marco's shadow looming. The next day, Julian met Ezra at a diner in Williamsburg, the kind with sticky tables and waitresses who called you Han. Ezra was sketching on a napkin, his brow furrowed in concentration. Julian watched him, memorizing the curve of his jaw, the way his curls fell over his forehead. "What's that one?" Julian asked, nodding at the napkin. Ezra slid it over. A rough sketch of Julian, laughing, his eyes bright. You when you're not trying so hard to hide, Ezra said softly. Julian's heart ached. He wanted to tell Ezra everything. The debt, the lies, the runs for Marco. But the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he reached for Ezra's hand under the table, their fingers intertwining. I'm not good at this, Julian admitted. Being real. You're doing fine, Ezra said, squeezing his hand. Just don't shut me out. That night, Julian made the delivery, his heart pounding as he handed off a package to a man with dead eyes in a back alley. He felt dirty, like the city's grime was seeping into his soul. When he got back to his apartment, Lila was waiting, her arms crossed. You look like shit, she said bluntly. What's going on, Julian? And don't lie to me this time. He collapsed onto the couch, his head in his hands. I fucked up, Lila. Big time. He told her about the tuition, the parties, the debt. Everything except being gay and the runs for Marco. Lila listened, her face softening but her eyes sharp. You need to get out of this, she said. Whatever it takes. You're better than this, Jay. I don't know how, he admitted, his voice breaking. Lila hugged him, fierce and protective, and for a moment, he felt less alone. But the burner phone in his pocket buzzed, a reminder that Marco wasn't done with him. Over the next month, Julian's life became a tightrope. By day, he was falling deeper for Ezra, their moments together a lifeline. Quiet kisses in Central Park, late-night talks about dreams and fears. Ezra opened up about his own struggles, coming out to his conservative family, the rejection that still stung. They don't talk to me anymore, he said one night, his voice raw. But I'd rather be alone than live a lie. Julian wanted to say he felt the same, but his secrets held him back. He still hadn't told Ezra he was gay, not explicitly, though he knew Ezra sensed it. Every time he tried to confess, the fear of losing him or worse, dragging him into his mess, stopped him. Then came the night that changed everything. Marco's latest job wasn't a delivery, it was a setup. Julian arrived at an abandoned lot in Red Hook, expecting the usual exchange, but instead he was jumped. Two men, faces obscured, pinned him down, their fists finding his ribs, his face. Tell Marco he's done. One of them growled before they vanished into the night. Julian stumbled home, bloodied and shaken, his phone shattered. Lila found him on the bathroom floor, cleaning his wounds. Jesus, Julian, she whispered, her hands trembling as she bandaged him up. You have to stop this. Now. I can't, he said, tears mixing with the blood on his face. If I don't pay him back, he'll come for me. Or worse. Then we figure it out, Lila said fiercely. But you're not doing this alone anymore. Julian didn't tell Ezra about the beating. He couldn't bear the thought of those gentle eyes turning to pity, or worse, fear. Instead, he avoided him for days, dodging texts with excuses about work. But Ezra wasn't easily shaken. On the fourth day, he showed up at Julian's apartment, his face a mix of worry and frustration. You can't just disappear on me, Ezra said, standing in the doorway. His voice was firm but soft, like he was holding back a storm of emotion. What happened to you? Julian's bruised face told a story he couldn't hide. He let Ezra in, and they sat on the sagging couch, the silence heavy. I got jumped, Julian said finally, his voice hollow. Wrong place, wrong time. Ezra's jaw tightened. That's not the whole story, is it? Julian looked away, shame burning in his chest. He wanted to tell Ezra everything. The debt, Marco, the lies, but the words felt like glass in his throat. Instead, he reached for Ezra's hand, holding it like an anchor. I'm trying, he whispered. I'm trying to be someone you deserve. Ezra's eyes softened, and he pulled Julian into a hug, careful of his bruises. You already are, he said, but you've got to let me in. That night, Julian told Ezra he was gay. The words came out haltingly, each one a weight lifted. Ezra listened, his hand never leaving Julian's. I knew, he said with a small smile, but I'm glad you told me. It means you trust me. Julian wanted to believe it was that simple, but Marco's shadow loomed larger than ever. The next day, Lila dragged Julian to a community center in Bed-Stuy, where she'd found a free legal aid clinic. The lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Miss Harper, listened as Julian spilled the truth about his debt and Marco's business. She didn't sugarcoat it. Julian was in deep, and Marco's operation sounded like it skirted the edges of organized crime. You need to cut ties, Miss Harper said, but you can't just walk away. We need evidence to protect you and to take him down. Julian's stomach churned. Betraying Marco could get him killed, but staying in his web was just as deadly. Lila squeezed his shoulder. We'll do this together, she said, but you've got to be all in. Over the next week, Julian started recording his interactions with Marco, texts, calls, the rare in-person meets. It was terrifying, every moment laced with the fear of being caught. But Lila was his rock, and Ezra, though still in the dark about the full extent of Julian's mess, was his reason to keep going. Every smile from Ezra, every touch, reminded Julian of the life he wanted, a life where he wasn't running. One evening, Julian and Ezra went to a queer poetry slam in Harlem, a small venue packed with vibrant voices and raw emotion. Julian sat in the back, Ezra's arm around him, feeling the weight of his secrets lighten just a little. A poet named Aisha took the stage, her words about love and survival cutting straight to Julian's core. Truth is a blade, she said. It hurts, but it frees you. After the slam, Julian and Ezra walked through the city, the night alive with possibility. I want to be free, Julian said suddenly, stopping under a streetlight. I want to be with you for real. No lies. Ezra's eyes searched his, and he nodded. Then be free, whatever it takes. But freedom came at a cost. The next day, Marco called Julian to a meet in an empty parking garage. Julian wore a wire, a tiny device Miss Harper had gotten from a contact in the DA's office. His heart pounded as Marco laid out the next job, a bigger one, involving a shipment Julian didn't want to think about. He played along, his voice steady even as his hands shook. When he left, he felt like he'd aged a decade. Lila met him at a coffee shop, her face pale as she listened to the recording. This is enough, she said. We take it to Harper tomorrow. Julian nodded, but fear gnawed at him. Marco wasn't stupid. If he suspected anything, Julian's life and maybe Lila's and Ezra's would be on the line. The meeting with Ms. Harper was a blur. She listened to the recording, her face grim but determined. This is solid, she said. Enough to get the police involved. But Julian, you need to stay low until they move on Marco. He's dangerous. Julian nodded, his mind racing. Staying low meant avoiding Ezra, which felt like cutting off his own heart. But he couldn't risk dragging Ezra into this. He sent a vague text. Need some space? I'll explain soon, and hated himself for it. For 3 days, Julian holed up in Lila's friend's apartment in Queens, a cramped space filled with second-hand furniture and the smell of incense. Lila stayed with him, her presence a lifeline. They played cards, watched bad reality TV, anything to keep his mind off the storm brewing. But every night, he dreamt of Ezra's face, the hurt in his eyes when Julian pulled away. On the 4th day, the police moved in. Ms. Harper called to say they'd raided Marco's operation, arresting him and half a dozen others. The evidence Julian provided was key, but it came with a catch. He'd have to testify if it went to trial. The thought made his stomach lurch, but for the first time he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he could finally be free. He called Ezra, his hands shaking as he dialed. "I need to see you," he said when Ezra picked up, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry I disappeared. I'll explain everything." They met on the rooftop where it all began, the city glittering below. Ezra's face was guarded, but his eyes softened when he saw Julian's. "You look like you've been through hell," he said. "I have," Julian admitted. He told Ezra everything: the tuition, the parties, Marco, the debt, the beating, the wire. The words poured out, raw and unfiltered, until he was crying, his face buried in his hands. "I was so scared I'd lose you," he said. "I'm still scared." Ezra pulled him close, his arms strong and steady. "You're not losing me," he said, "but you've got to stop running. From me, from yourself." Julian nodded, his tears soaking Ezra's shirt. For the first time, he believed he could change. Not just for Ezra, but for himself. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Julian started working with Ms. Harper to clear his debt legally, taking on odd jobs to chip away at it. He got a part-time gig at a bookstore in the village, a quiet job that gave him time to think. He and Ezra grew closer, their relationship deepening as Julian learned to let go of his fear. They spent evenings cooking together, laughing over burnt pasta and stolen kisses. But Marco's trial loomed, and with it, the fear of retaliation. Julian couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. One night, as he walked home from the bookstore, he noticed a car idling across the street, its driver obscured. His heart raced, but he kept walking, telling himself it was paranoia. Lila noticed his unease and insisted he stay with her for a while. "You're not doing this alone," she said, echoing her earlier promise. Julian was grateful, but he hated feeling like a burden. He wanted to be the man Ezra saw in him, the man he was starting to believe he could be. The trial came faster than Julian expected. He sat in the courtroom, his hands clammy, as Marco's eyes bore into him from the defendant's table. The testimony was grueling, every word a step toward freedom and a step deeper into fear. But when it was over and Marco was sentenced to 7 years, Julian felt a weight lift. Not all of it. There was still the debt, the years of lies to unravel, but enough to breathe. He went straight to Ezra's studio, collapsing into his arms. "It's done," he said, his voice muffled against Ezra's shoulder. "I'm done hiding." Ezra kissed his forehead, his hands gentle but firm. "I'm proud of you," he said. "You faced it all." Julian started rebuilding his life piece by piece. He enrolled in community college, taking night classes toward a degree in social work. The bookstore job became full-time, and he moved into a tiny apartment with Ezra, their space filled with art and laughter. Lila visited often, her teasing keeping Julian grounded. One evening, a year later, Julian and Ezra stood on their rooftop, the same one where they'd first connected. The city was alive below them, a testament to the chaos they'd survived. Julian took Ezra's hand, his heart full. "I used to think I'd never be enough," he said. "Not for you, not for anyone. But you showed me I could be." Ezra smiled, his eyes bright with love. "You were always enough, Julian. You just had to believe it." They kissed, the city lights blurring around them, and Julian knew he'd found something worth more than any party, any lie, a life where he could be himself, scars and all. His secrets had nearly destroyed him, but they'd also led him to Ezra, to Lila, to a truth he'd never thought possible. Love was stronger than fear, and he was stronger than his past.